Medieval castles are the kind of structures that, just by picturing them, whisk you away to a world of knights, tournaments, and feasts where someone always ends up with mead in their beard. These stone fortresses, with towers that seem to scrape the sky and walls that defy time, are far more than just the backdrop for fantasy films. In the Middle Ages, they were the heart of feudal life, centers of power, homes, prisons, and even makeshift offices for the era's bureaucracy. But behind their aura of grandeur lie fascinating stories, architectural ingenuity, and a hefty dose of inconveniences that would have any millennial begging for Wi-Fi and central heating. In this narrative, we'll dive into 10 incredible facts about medieval castles, delivered with an informative tone but a touch of humor so it doesn't feel like you're slogging through a dusty textbook. Before we start, if you're a history buff and want more content like this, don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel, where we upload videos packed with medieval curiosities. Hit that button and join the adventure. Now, get ready for a trip to the past, where battlements were all the rage and the moat was definitely not a hot tub. Let's kick off with the first fact, the humble origins of castles. If you're imagining that all medieval castles were like Disney's, with perfectly symmetrical towers and flags fluttering in the breeze, you're in for a surprise. The earliest castles, back in the 9th and 10th centuries, were more like makeshift structures known as motte-and-bailey. The motte was an artificial hill, often built by peasants armed with shovels and a lot of patience, while the bailey was a fenced area at the hill's base. Atop the motte stood a wooden tower, more functional than aesthetic. These castles were the medieval equivalent of a prefab house. Cheap, quick to build, and not exactly fireproof. Wood, while practical, had a tiny flaw. It burned like tinder when an enemy showed up with a torch. Over time, feudal lords, tired of seeing their strongholds turn into bonfires, began building in stone. That's how the castles we associate with the Middle Ages were born, with walls so thick they could withstand a catapult barrage and a king's ego at the same time. Building a stone castle was no small feat, which brings us to the second fact, the colossal effort required to erect these fortresses. Picture a construction project with no cranes, no electricity, and a workforce that would rather be home milking cows. Depending on the size, a castle could take anywhere from 5 to 20 years to complete, and that's if everything went smoothly. For instance, Dover Castle in England, one of the most iconic, took about a decade for its main phase in the 12th century. Stones were quarried locally, hand-carved with rudimentary tools, and hauled in ox-drawn carts or, if lucky, by boats if a river was nearby. If the castle was on a hill, as many were, getting those rocks up was an ordeal that would make Hercules sweat. Medieval architects, who didn't have college degrees but had impressive talent, used pulleys, wooden scaffolding, and earthen ramps to move materials. Then there was the feudal lord, overseeing the project with a goblet of wine in hand, demanding more battlements because, according to him, battlements are the future. The cost was astronomical. Hundreds of workers, from masons to carpenters, were needed, and the funds came from peasant taxes, who probably weren't thrilled about financing their lord's new palace. The third fact is that castles weren't just military strongholds but true multifunctional hubs. Sure, their main purpose was defense against invaders, but they also served as noble residences, food warehouses, courtrooms, and even venues for medieval parties that could last days. The Great Hall was the epicenter of castle life. Here, the feudal lord received vassals, settled disputes, like who stole the neighbor's pig, and hosted feasts where food was so plentiful that the dogs under the table gorged on scraps. But don't picture a cozy spot with ambient lighting. Castles were cold, damp, and drafty enough to snuff out a torch in seconds. Fireplaces, which became more common in the 12th century, helped a bit but only warmed the area near the fire. Windows were small and narrow, designed to block enemy arrows, which meant natural light was a luxury. If you wanted to stay warm, your best bet was a thick blanket, an animal pelt, or a big dog willing to share its body heat. Wealthier kings and nobles could afford tapestries and curtains to block the cold, but even they shivered in winter. Now, let's talk about the fourth fact, the infamous moats. If you've seen a medieval movie, You probably imagine a moat teeming with hungry crocodiles or piranhas with a bad attitude. Sorry to burst your bubble, but that's pure myth. Moats were essentially ditches surrounding the castle, either filled with water, diverted from a nearby river, or left dry with pointed stakes at the bottom. Their main job was to make life hard for attackers, forcing them to cross under a hail of arrows or try filling the moat with dirt while dodging projectiles. But moats had a less glamorous side. They were the castle's dumping ground. Residents tossed everything from food scraps to human waste, turning some moats into a stench soup you wouldn't want to sniff. If you were an enemy soldier, crossing a moat wasn't just dangerous, it was an olfactory experience that made you question your career choice. Some castles, like Bodiam in England, have moats that look like they belong in a painting, but back in the day, they were more functional than decorative. The fifth fact focuses on castle defenses, which were genuine masterpieces of military ingenuity. Walls weren't just tall, they were designed to be death traps. Battlements, those jagged tops, let archers shoot while ducking for cover. Towers had arrow slits, narrow openings for launching arrows or, in extreme cases, pouring hot liquids, though the boiling oil myth is a bit exaggerated. Hot water or sand was more common. Gates were another strong point. Many had a portcullis, a metal grate that could drop to block entry, and behind it often lay a narrow passage rigged with traps, like sealing holes for dropping stones or more archers. Some castles, like Croc de Chevaliers in Syria, had zigzag entrances that forced attackers to expose themselves while turning like in a poorly designed video game. Plus, castles often had multiple layers of walls, so if you breached the first, you still faced a second or third round of misery. Attacking a castle was like trying to steal food from a dragon. Technically possible, but likely to end badly. Moving on to the sixth fact, daily life inside a castle, which wasn't as glamorous as you might think. Yes, nobles lived better than peasants, but better didn't mean comfortable. Private rooms were small and often shared. Privacy was almost non-existent. Servants slept on the great hall's floor, and even the lord and lady might have an audience while bathing. Hygiene left much to be desired. Baths were rare, and clean water was a luxury. Latrines were holes in the wall leading outside or, worse, to the moat. If the wind blew the wrong way, the castle smelled like a mix of farm and sewer. Food depended on the lord's wealth. Feasts might feature delicacies like venison, swan, or even peacock, but in lean times, everyone made do with stale bread and watery soup. Kitchens were massive, with fireplaces big enough for multiple cooks, but the fire risk was constant.
Picture the head chef yelling, "Watch the stew, don't burn down the castle."
The seventh fact is about the cost of maintaining a castle. Building one was expensive, but keeping it running was like owning a yacht in the Middle Ages, a bottomless money pit. You had to pay soldiers, feed servants, repair walls, and ensure the moat didn't turn into a swamp. Feudal lords relied on peasant taxes and land rents, but a bad harvest or war could tank the finances. Some castles were abandoned because their owners simply couldn't afford the upkeep. Imagine the lord staring at his ledger, saying, "Well, looks like we can't afford the North Tower this year.
Someone dismantle it."
For kings, maintaining a network of castles was a way to control territory, but also a burden. That's why many castles were built strategically near resources, like rivers or forests, to ease the supply of food and firewood. The eighth fact takes us to sieges, the blockbuster moment for any castle. A siege could last weeks, months, or even years, testing the endurance of both sides. Attackers surrounded the castle, cut off supplies, and waited for the defenders to surrender from hunger, disease, or sheer boredom. Castles were built to withstand this, with storehouses packed with grain, salted meat, and water if they had a well. But life during a siege was grim. Food was rationed, diseases spread, and morale plummeted. Attackers used weapons like catapults, trebuchets, and siege towers, giant scaffolds for scaling walls. Sometimes, they launched creative projectiles, like dead animals or even severed heads, to terrify defenders. Defenders fought back with arrows, stones, and plenty of ingenuity. At Rochester Castle in 1215, defenders used pig fat to burn a siege tower. A siege was like a deadly game of patience, where the winner had more supplies or fewer scruples. The ninth fact is about the political role of castles. They weren't just homes or fortresses but symbols of power. Owning a castle was like having a private jet in the Middle Ages. It showed you were a big deal. Kings and nobles built castles to flaunt their wealth and authority, which is why many were decked out with tapestries, carved furniture, and, in rare cases, stained glass that cost a fortune. Castles also served as administrative hubs, where lords managed lands, collected taxes, and settled disputes. Plus, they doubled as makeshift prisons. If a knight rebelled or a peasant got too vocal, they might end up in a dungeon, not as dramatic as in movies, but definitely not a spa. Some castles, like the Tower of London, became symbols of oppression, where high-profile prisoners awaited their fate, often with a front-row view of the executioner. The 10th fact is about the evolution and legacy of castles. With the arrival of gunpowder in the 14th century, castles began losing their military edge. Walls, once invincible, could be toppled by cannons, forcing architects to design fortresses with lower, thicker walls, often in a star shape to deflect shots. By the end of the Middle Ages, many castles became luxurious residences or were abandoned. Some, like Windsor Castle, survived by adapting to new roles, like royal residences. Today, castles are tourist attractions, museums, or even luxury hotels. Places like Carcassonne in France or Neuschwanstein in Germany, though the latter is more of a 19th century fantasy castle, draw millions of visitors. Walking through a medieval castle feels like time travel, but with modern bathrooms and no risk of stray arrows. Yet, many have been restored so enthusiastically they feel more like theme parks than medieval strongholds. Now, let's dig deeper into each of these facts to better understand the life and impact of medieval castles. Starting with origins, motte-and-bailey castles were a practical solution for a turbulent Europe. After the Roman Empire's fall, the continent was a mess of Viking raids, Magyar invasions, and local feuds. Lords needed quick fortifications, and these earth and wood structures fit the bill. They could be built in weeks, and if enemies showed up, you at least had a hill to chuck rocks from. Over time, political stability let nobles invest in stone, leading to more complex castles. For example, Carnarvon Castle in Wales, built by Edward I, shows how castles evolved into monumental structures blending defense with political propaganda. Stone castle construction required not just resources but meticulous planning. Medieval architects, though lacking formal degrees, were geometry and logistics wizards. They used tools like compasses and levels to ensure stable walls. Stones were cut into uniform blocks, and mortars made of lime and sand were surprisingly durable. Some castles, like Conwy in Wales, were built near water to ease material transport. But it wasn't all physical labor. Lords had to negotiate with craft guilds, deal with weather delays, and ensure peasants didn't revolt over taxes. In some cases, kings conscripted prisoners or soldiers to work, which didn't exactly boost team morale. The multifunctional life of castles is another fascinating angle. The Great Hall wasn't just for feasts but a workspace. Here, lords heard petitions, signed documents, and decided who went to the dungeon. Kitchens were a hive of activity, with constant fires and giant pots feeding dozens. But life wasn't just for nobles. Castles were like small towns, with their own blacksmiths, bakers, and even chaplains for daily masses. In peacetime, everyone pitched in during a siege, from cooks hurling hot water to ladies helping load arrows. Moats, though less glamorous, were a key design feature. Some castles, like Leeds in England, had moats so big they looked like lakes. Keeping them clean was impossible, and many became health hazards. At Carlaverock Castle in Scotland, the triangular moat was more a style statement than a practical defense, but it still intimidated enemies. Drawbridges, which could be raised to block access, were another innovation. Some even had traps, like sections that collapsed under attackers' weight. If you crossed the moat, you still faced the walls, which brings us back to defenses. Castle defenses were a testament to human ingenuity. Beyond battlements and arrow slits, many had flanking towers, letting defenders shoot from multiple angles. Concentric castles, like Beaumaris in Wales, had multiple wall layers, creating a death maze for attackers. Some even had secret tunnels for escapes or resupply during sieges. At Chinon Castle in France, legend says Joan of Arc used one to meet the Dauphin. Psychology also played a role. Towering walls and imposing turrets were designed to intimidate, making enemies think twice before attacking. Daily life, though less epic, is equally intriguing. Nobles enjoyed luxuries like canopied beds and fancy food, but servants had it rough. Latrines, for instance, were a constant issue. At Warwick Castle, they were built on overhangs, with waste dropping to the ground or moat. Clothing was another challenge. Nobles wore wool and furs, but washing was tough, and damp odors were everywhere. Feasts, while impressive, required massive logistics. At a big castle like Edinburgh, hundreds of dishes, roast boar to feathered pies, could be served in one night. Maintenance costs were a constant headache. Castles needed endless repairs, especially after sieges or storms. Walls cracked, wooden roofs rotted, and latrines, well, needed regular cleaning. Kings often delegated castle management to castellans, medieval property managers who ensured storehouses were stocked, soldiers trained, and taxes collected. Some castles were leased to lesser nobles, generating income but also legal disputes when payments lagged. Sieges were the ultimate test for any castle. Some, like Harlech in Wales during the Wars of the Roses, lasted years.
Defenders relied on wits and resources.
At Chillon Castle in Switzerland, Lake Geneva provided water, prolonging resistance. Attackers developed ever fancier weapons, like trebuchets that hurled 200-kilo projectiles. Psychological warfare was key. Attackers shouted insults or drummed all night to keep defenders awake. At Kenilworth in 1266, defenders held out 6 months but surrendered when food ran out. The political role of castles went beyond military use. They were symbols of authority, used by kings to cement power.
In England, William the Conqueror built dozens to control the Anglo-Saxons after the 1066 Norman invasion.
Some, like the Tower of London, became torture and execution hubs, though they also housed the Mint and Royal Archives. Castles were also hotbeds of political intrigue. At Falaise Castle, William's birthplace, decisions were made that shaped Europe's fate. Finally, the evolution of castles mirrors medieval society's changes. Gunpowder upended the game, forcing castles to adapt or vanish. Some, like Stirling in Scotland, became Renaissance palaces with ornate halls and gardens. Others, like Dunluce in Ireland, fell into romantic ruin. Today, castles remind us of a world where power was measured in stone, and every tower told a story. Visiting one is like opening a history book, but without worrying about the moat's smell. In conclusion, medieval castles were far more than fortresses. They were homes, offices, and battlegrounds, built with near superhuman effort. From stinky moats to cunning walls, they tell tales of ambition, war, and survival. Next time you see a castle, whether on a postcard or in person, remember the centuries of life behind those stones, with their moments of glory and bone-chilling winters. And if you're ever invited to a medieval feast, bring an extra blanket. Castles don't forgive the cold. If you enjoyed this journey through the Middle Ages, don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel for more captivating stories about castles, knights, and everything that makes history so incredible. Click the button and keep exploring the past with us.